Morning, everybody. Lovely to see the familiar faces in happy Cairns. Being a Brisbane girl myself, it's lovely always to come up here. Georgie is our risk advisor from New South Wales, so she's come up to enjoy the time up here with me as well. Georgie's been with us for about 7 months, and it's great to have more of. We've increased our risk advisory team in Avant. So, before we get started, I'd really like to say that if you're not aware, we are there to help you at any point. Some of you already have my email. You're welcome to have it at the end. You can also phone the Medico-legal advisory hotline. If you've got any questions, any risk issues, just don't hesitate to reach out. Even if we don't know the answer, we'll get back to you. If it's not our area, we'll try and direct you to where you can. We really do prefer to have a proactive support with you guys. We know it's really hard to run practices. Most of us have run practices ourselves, so we know what it's like to walk that journey. And I often say, I managed practices for years, own practice. I went on and did other studies, including a master's in risk management. So I'll give you the theory, but I also know where the roadblocks are. So we are there to practically support you in any way possible. And, particularly if you have a practice policy, we get calls, we get emails all the time from our practice owners or practice managers, particularly. So don't hesitate to reach out. If in the future you would like a risk assessment, which is complimentary as part of your, owning a practice policy with Avant, let me know and I'll put you on the list for when we're next in Cairns. There's no fee for that. That's just part of what we do to support you. I'm more than happy to come and do that. And what we often will do with that is sort of go through a whole list of issues. Some people think it's similar to accreditation. We go far deeper than that. Probably years ago, I used to say, because I've been with Avant for 18 years, I used to say there was a misconception that if a practice was accredited, they were a quality practice. That's, sorry to tell you this, my experience is that's not necessarily the case, because there's a lot of tick and flicking that happens depending on the quality of the surveyor. So we go much deeper. So we're there to support you. Reach out, let me know today, email me if you want me to put you on the list for next time we're up in Cairns. So I'm going to hand over to Georgie for a minute. Can you hear? Yeah. Oh, sorry. I should have said Nev Donald is in the back of the room. Our happy Nev, we should call him. And Nev's quite a character. So he's one of our business development managers in the Queensland office along with Tony. And many of you have probably come across both Tony and Nev. So we're going to start off, and as you know, it's going to be mostly on telemedicine. But what we want to emphasise before we start is that we are going to be doing a lot of reading of this because there are some key points we do not want to miss. We've done a lot of preparation for this. Sometimes if you just try and use your head and it's in memory, it doesn't give you as much information. So if we're looking at it, that's what we're doing. We're making sure we're covering it all. So I'll let Georgie take over now and let's get the ball rolling. Feel free to ask questions along the way. Just, stop any question at all. If we don't know the answer, we'll get back to you. If it starts to go off track because of time, we'll pull it back in and we'll be available afterwards for a little while if you want to have a chat. Okay. Yeah. Why is this not moving?
We're doing it on Teams and it's just, wow.
Okay, so you got to do it that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
It's all right, Adrian. You're doing a very good job.
Morning. Thanks for inviting us today, Marion and I. We're going to cover the topics of telemedicine, and that's including ensuring the management of the regulatory frameworks, platform privacy and security, and the risks of cyber, use of remote apps, and business continuity. But before we start, we just want to share with you some of the claims and complaints that we see at Avant that relate surrounding telehealth. That's going to help add some context to the conversation for you. And it's also important for you to know about matters that have occurred in the past for doctors that they've faced, as well as to help you prepare for the future practice, supporting them in the practice in the future. You may or may not be aware, but Avant have a dedicated claims coding team, and they look at all of our medico-legal claims from patients. They also look at when they're suing the doctors, as well as tracking complaints for regulators, and that's including APRA, OHO in Queensland, the HCCC in New South Wales, as well as Medicare and the Department of Health. So we've now been lucky enough to gather enough data to COVID-related claims data to support to start reporting at this level, which is really important. And COVID really was the advent of telehealth, as I'm sure you're all aware. You all got shocked into that quite quickly. And with the uptake over the last few years being greater than what's probably occurred over the last decade. You can see from the pie chart at the top left of the screen that from all the COVID-related claims, complaints and notifications, that 16% of them were related to telehealth. That's quite a substantial portion. You can see the in the top right corner that this pie chart breaks the telehealth complaints segment down further into 3 areas. And then you can see that the majority, over half, relate to patients and the clinical aspects of telehealth. So that could be things like diagnosis, treatment, or the care following a procedure. 30% of complaints or notifications came from workplace issues. That might have been issues that the doctors were having with their practices regarding setting up telehealth or actually working from home. And then 18% came from patients who are about the non-clinical aspects of telehealth, such as administration, billing practices regarding setting up telehealth.
And that's okay. So it's interesting because if you look at the data that Georgie just showed you now, and then you look at this next slide was from 2018 to 2020, and that was sort of before we were collecting data about the COVID-related telemedicine. And the previous data included notifications, which what we call haven't yet matured. So sometimes if something goes wrong in your practice or you get a complaint from a patient you think can turn into a claim, you have a duty under the policy to notify Avant. So when we talk about notifications of incidents, that's what we talk about. So we'll have them on record, but that doesn't necessarily mean they've come to maturity, which means they may not have developed into anything yet. So that data is still something that we'd be catching up on later. But it's interesting because the claims that came at a time when telehealth was actually not being used in a substantial way, such as in COVID, since COVID times, it will reflect, if you compare the past to the future, we are going to see a lot more telemedicine related claims. And we are certainly seeing a lot more disciplinary related claims relating to telemedicine for patients, particularly complaining about how they perceive you've delivered the service for telemedicine, around issues of Medicare. So our data, this slide is actually from about 10,000 coded claims from the 3 years, 2018 to 20. You can see from the graph in the top left, from all of the claims in that time, only 1% related to telemedicine. 21% were compensation claims. So that's when patients try to sue doctors. And the remaining 79% were disciplinary claims. Now, when we talk about disciplinary claims, we're talking about complaints to OHO. Do you know who OHO is? OHO is the Office of the Health Ombudsman, used to be called Health Quality Complaints Commission. It's our regulatory body in Queensland. It's where patients will make a complaint, and not just patients. Sometimes it can be nurses who are dobbing in another doctor, or it can be doctors vexatiously dobbing in another, or it can be a doctor who's genuinely concerned about something that they've noticed happening in another practice. But that's where it goes to OHO or to APRA, and that's a disciplinary matter. So 79% is a pretty big chunk of our claims, and particularly relates to GPs. How many non-GP specialists are in the room? Okay, what specialty are you? respiratory? Of course, yeah. So you will still find that telemedicine probably for the non-GP specialties. Anecdotally, I know you don't seem to generate as much complaints as general practice does. Because as you know, the telemedicine, has to be sort of referred by a GP for you to be sort of involved anyway. And what I've noticed over the years is that people, particularly in the regional and rural settings, are so grateful to be able to access a non-GP specialist that the complaints don't seem to be as much in the non-GP specialty world. Have you experienced any complaints about your telemedicine? No, okay. So the top 5 issues, and I don't think this is going to be surprising to you, that related to telehealth matters in our data were medication issues, the behaviour of the doctor and communication, and sometimes about staff, the issues with the procedure or the surgery that was performed, consent and record keeping. So most of them were about patient-centeredness, but the majority of our disciplinary complaints are around communication. And patients' perception and their expectations weren't met. And so, that it's just so important. And I'd really like, and I don't think it's a surprise to any of you, leave that message with you. The biggest issue in your practices that we see when we go out to the practices, when we're sitting in the waiting room, and we see with the complaints from about our doctors and about staff, is about communication. It's perception of communication from the staff, from the patient. Just quickly, and I know you've probably heard me speak about this before, but it's something that I really like to actually talk about, because I think it's really important for you to pass on to your support staff. If they walk in their patient's shoes and they look at the patient's, what I call the cycle of service, from the time they contact your practice, whether it's on the website, whether it's by phone, by the time they walk in, by the time they see the doctor, and by the time you invoice them, and then the follow-up, that's a cycle of service, and anything can go wrong in that time. And I don't think your support staff realise how important their role is. And I often refer to them as the director of first impressions. You know yourselves when you've gone to a doctor, you walk in, it might be a really busy clinic. It depends on the quality of the culture in that practice, I think, how welcomed a patient feels. And even if it's really busy, just for the staff to be trained to make eye contact and raise their finger to more or less say, I know you're there, I'm not ignoring you, can make a difference to that patient. Patients that come into a waiting room and then they get nothing from the staff, and then they're kept waiting for an hour for the privilege of going in, having a consult, but they don't perceive they got what they wanted. And then they come out and hit with a hefty bill, which they have to wait 10 more minutes for in a queue to pay for. You can see bit by bit by bit by bit, it's building up. And also even in the consultation room, whether it be a plastic surgeon who's asking for a patient to undress to examine them, is there a privacy screen? What sort of respect is being shown here? If it's in a GP's rooms, they're doing a pap smear. The poor woman is, in a very vulnerable position, and the doctor goes to get the speculum and it's not there. Then he has to leave the room. Then somebody else is barging in the room for some other reason. Where is that responsibility? And it's from the support staff. How well do they keep that room stocked to actually enable that consultation to flow smoothly and respectfully? So I think, if you can drum that into your support staff, how important their role is, because a complaint can be triggered from that series of that cycle of service. And if every one of those cycle of service points, the patient's perception is they haven't actually had a good service, they're pretty much going to actually complain. Our data is showing that the disciplinary matters have skyrocketed. And I think we've said this before, since the indemnity crisis years ago and the tort reform that came as a result of that, our litigation, so patient suing, has dropped, but the patient complaints have skyrocketed. So they're still finding a way to proceed, if you like. So
A bit of a Q&A.
yeah. So we're going to have just a bit of a Q&A, and please, as I said, just stop us at any point that you want to ask a question.
So we're going to start talk about the regulatory environment now relating to telehealth. And we're going to start with AHPRA and the Medical Board, who developed the codes and guidelines to guide the profession. So Mariana, what are the Medical Board's expectations relating to the Code of Conduct and Guidelines?
Yes, so there are 2 publications which If you don't know them, I would highly recommend that you do look up ARPA, just put in these keywords that come up really quickly. Most of your doctors, when you ask the question, are you familiar with the code of conduct? I would say probably 50% are not aware of the code of conduct. Your nurses are also under the same code of conduct. In fact, anybody who's working in your practice, if it's a multidisciplinary practice and they're registered with ARPA, they still have a code of conduct which they're answerable to. So the medical board, particularly relating to telemedicine topic, there's the doctor's code of conduct, and then there's telemedicine guidelines. If a complaint presents about a doctor or your practice relating to telemedicine, and we're particularly talking about telemedicine, but in fact about anything, the medical board will use the code of conduct to see whether the doctor has actually met what would be expected according to the code of conduct, and they will be judged by that. In addition, to use these as a guideline to actually help you to develop your policies and procedures is a very wise thing, because it provides really good risk mitigation strategies. And if a complaint comes in, they will refer back to these guidelines to say, did you comply? Did you actually meet the guidelines that you were supposed to be working by? So it does set out a really good range of principles. And it will definitely relate back to how that doctor consulted with the patient as well. So even if it's not just about telemedicine, most of the complaints, they will refer back to the code of conduct. So just make sure your doctors are aware of it. I just want to go through some of the guidelines here, and I've highlighted some of the things that I think are really important. The consideration that probably causes the most anxiety about telehealth is about whether the telehealth consultation was appropriate, and specifically whether a physical examination is required. And, you know, the important word here is the judgment. It's the clinical judgment of the doctor of whether a telehealth consultation was appropriate, and whether a physical examination should also be followed if during the consultation they realise, you know, that there needs to be a physical examination. So how do you manage the patient's expectation of the telemedicine consult? And I'm sure a lot of you were really quite confronted with this, particularly at the beginning of COVID. And that's for the non-GP specialists and the GP specialists too. Because, you know, for the non-GP specialists, you've been used to preparing for telemedicine. And I'm sure you've got the blurb, you know, really down pat. But COVID sort of just threw it out there that, you know, telemedicine was conducted at the height of COVID for nearly all consultations. And how did you prepare the patients to what do they expected from this consultation? And so how many of you created a blurb, if you like, a script for your front desk staff to actually tell the patients of what they were to expect with a telehealth consultation that they were going to have with the doctor? Did any of you prepare a script for your front desk staff? I would recommend that you do that. You did, great. And it was, I think if you did that, it just helps the staff to know what is going to happen. How do we educate our patients that this is how it's going to work, this is what's going to happen, this is how the billing is going to occur, etc., etc. I would also encourage you, if you are going to continue doing a lot of telemedicine, to put information on your website so patients can actually see, and you can put a lot of the blurbs there. You know, what happens when you are booked in for a telehealth consultation? What do you expect? Because again, getting back to what we said before, most of our complaints are about patients' expectations not being met. A lot of it's about poor communication at the beginning. So provide an explanation to the patient about what the process involves. Explain to the patients how they get their prescriptions, and we'll talk about that soon, or how imaging or pathology tests will be arranged, and how referrals will be managed via telehealth and the follow-up. And as I said, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, yep.
Mariana, how do the RACGP guidelines, the guide to providing telephone and video consultations in general practice, impact on the doctors and their practices?
So again, it is a really great supportive guideline if you haven't seen this, and I'd also recommend even the non-GP specialists, you probably can access this. A lot of our RCGP resources are available to non-members. There is sometimes more detail that you can't get into. But if you can't, for the non-GP specialist, by the way, the PHN could probably give you a copy. I'd highly recommend that you do look at this and really use it as a review tool in your practices to see that you actually have all of this in place. It's a really helpful practical guide, as well as meeting the legislative requirements of telehealth. There's a really good flow chart, telehealth flow chart within that. It includes details of what's required before, during and after consultation, and the technology is just one part of it. But, you know, the biggest issue and the biggest point about this is to support the patient journey and the patient care, both at the time of the telemedicine consult and continuity of care later. So highly recommend that you look at that one. Okay. Yep.
Medicare is one of the main regulatory considerations for doctors. Medicare audits are prevalent, and Avant's involved with assisting many of our members relating to Medicare audits. Let's look at some of the issues under scrutiny by Medicare. Can any GP conduct a telehealth consultation for any patient?
Now, this has been a big issue, as many of you probably realise, that 12-month rule. Is anybody familiar with what that 12-month rule is? Okay. So just to clarify, in the general practice setting, that patient had to have been seen in that practice within the last 12 months to be able to conduct a telemedicine consultation. If some people think it has to be conducted by that GP who's, you know, booked the appointment for this patient. So say if Georgie was the GP and I'm the patient, and I've never seen Georgie before, but I've seen somebody else in that practice, that is the rule. It doesn't have to be that I've seen Georgie. It's anybody in that practice that that patient has seen within the past 12 months. And be very, very careful about that rule, because we know with some of the doctors that we are helping, there are audits going on from Medicare relating to telemedicine, and particularly relating to the COVID period. There's a bit of catch up that they're going to be doing. Just be very careful that your doctors are doing the right thing, that the screening at the front desk for that 12-month rule has been done. Can you tell me, anybody, well, what are you doing to screen that before you actually book a telehealth consultation now? And this would be for the, particularly for the non-GPs, sorry, the GPs. And so they're asking, and are they documenting that? Do you have a checklist? No. Okay. So the front desk staff are saying, have you seen the doctor in the past 12 months? And thank you. And that was the point I was getting, because you can't just rely on the patient saying that, because they're going to want the easy consult. Well, actually, interestingly enough, through COVID, you would have seen patients only wanted telehealth. What is your feeling now that the patients want? Yeah, it's really interesting, because my husband's a GP and he was doing telehealth for a while, and a lot of his elderly patients really liked it. And bit by bit, he was sort of having to try to encourage them to come back in. And now most of them don't want telehealth. They actually want to see a person. And I think that's probably partly to do with all the lockdowns and lack of that, you know, that face-to-face contact. Because as you know, a lot of the issues with telehealth is that you're missing, depending on the quality of the Skype, if they're doing Skype, you're missing the cues, the facial cues, the mental health issues that you'd be seeing if somebody's sitting in front of you. And this is what the data is showing, is that there are so much more mental health issues now due to COVID, due to a lot of telehealth where so many things have been missed. So you'll find that a lot of patients now want actually face-to-face. How many of you are struggling with a doctor who does not want to come back into the practice? Gosh, that's tricky, because that is so tricky, because I'm sure you're noticing a drop off in patients who want to book a consultation with him. Is he really, for telehealth? Yeah. So is he just doing telehealth for any patient across the practice?
he just gets them to need to be seen.
Mm.
Stuff, so yeah, so he's been just 3 months. I don't know how long it's going to go on for.
Yeah, it's really hard for the practices to keep managing this. But the big issue that you named is absolutely correct. How do you arrange a physical examination if a doctor is actually conducting a telehealth consultation and they decide that that patient needs a physical examination? Who in the practice is going to do that, particularly if it's he's not coming in at all?
So he's not do that, or if they're diabetic, they come do some of the diabetic assessment.
How are you charging? So he's had a telehealth consultation in the morning. He has assessed that that patient needs a physical examination in the afternoon. How are you charging? And that patient's seeing another doctor.
And sometimes it doesn't actually. No, you need to go and see the doctor, so he doesn't actually do that consultation. He just documents certain things when you follow up, so that the GP sees and then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody else in the room? Are you charging for 2 separate consultations in a day? If it's telehealth and then a physical examination consultation?
I've seen it.
You want to be very careful,
Exactly.
very, very careful.
So it's the same.
That's right. Yeah. And that's what most practices are doing, because it is a bit tricky. If you are audited by Medicare, you're going to have your medical records detailed enough to actually support that there was a need for a separate consultation that can be billed separately under the MBS Medicare prescriber number item numbers. So just be very careful of that. As I said, the audits that Medicare is conducting are ramping up a lot, particularly relating to telehealth. So just be really mindful, and we'll go through some of those issues.
Back to the 12-month rule. Are there any exemptions relating to the 12-month rule?
Yes, that's a good point, Georgie. So you're probably aware, but just to clarify, there is an exemption to the 12-month rule where the patient doesn't have to be seen in the last 12 months to have telehealth, and that's for children under the age of 12 months. They can be seen if, people who are homeless, that's an exemption, so they don't have to have been seen by the practice for the last 12 months. Patients living in a COVID-19 impacted area, so that there's a lockdown, that's an exemption. And patients receiving an urgent after hours service, or patients of medical practitioners at an Aboriginal medical centre or an Aboriginal community controlled health service. Anybody work for any of the AMSs, Aboriginal Medical Services? Right, okay, so there's quite specific exemptions to the 12 months rule for that group of people. With under 12 months, patients living in a COVID-19 impacted area, people who are homeless, and people who are Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders.
Do patients have to be present for telehealth attendance, including in aged care?
Yeah, so what's your view of that? Do patients have to be present for the telehealth? To, say in aged care, or if it's a carer? Can the carer sit in and be that substitute for that patient?
It's been a quite. There anyway. With the child's not there, unfortunately, not able to give you a rebate, and we can have some patients kick off about that.
So I would encourage you to give information on your website or whatever to actually clearly state the patient has to be present. Even if a mum says, here's Johnny. Johnny, say hello to the doctor. How are you? Yeah, I'm good. And then Johnny wanders off, is having a bit of a play, whatever. They have to still be present for that consultation. You cannot actually have a substitute like a carer. It's the same principle as if care is coming into your practice and they want to speak to the doctor about their elderly mum. If that person isn't there, you cannot charge a Medicare rebate for that. You can charge, but not a Medicare rebate. So how many of you have had issues where, particularly with the telehealth and particularly at the height of COVID, and I've heard a lot of non-GP specialists say this has been really difficult, where they will have a scheduled telehealth consultation and, mum and dad are driving along in the car with 6 kids in the back. And Dad has some issues with his penis, and this is being discussed over. We have heard so many stories about this that, you know, it's just incredible, the lack of thought or the lack of respect for the privacy for themselves, but also for that doctor. And most doctors, and we would encourage you, if the doctor is in a situation where there are other people in the car, other people in the room, ask the question, is there anybody else present for this consultation? If there are and they need to be involved in that consultation, notate who was present. And we would say that whether it's telehealth or face-to-face consultation, any third person who's in that consultation room should actually be documented who it was. Whether it's one of your chaperones, document that chaperone was in the room and who it was. Whether it's a carer, whether it's a husband or wife, it should be documented. The same as the telehealth consultations. And the numbers of our doctors that have said how difficult it's been through telehealth, and we would say, you ask who's present, are you in the car? If you're in the car and you're not on your own, sorry, we have to reschedule this appointment. And I would suggest that you're very firm about it too. It's inappropriate because they're not going to take in the same information either if they've got a lot of distractions, which could be quite, you know, really quite important to their health. So that was a long answer to that, wasn't it?
Is a practice expected to bulk bill for telehealth attendances?
What is your response to that? She does, yeah. It's interesting. Okay, so you bulk bill all? Right, okay. What about for the GPs? You charge? But do you bulk bill? Or do you? So you're privately billing? Okay, what if it was a COVID related consultation? That's the answer. Mostly not for you guys because they may not be able to attend because of COVID, but for the GPs in the room, if it's totally COVID related telehealth service, you can only bulk bill. You cannot charge a private fee for that. That's different. Yeah, but your documentation needs to support it though. And that's the key issue that Medicare are looking at when they're doing these audits. In fact, whatever audits Medicare are doing, whether it's telehealth related or other MBS item numbers, be very mindful that the key thing they're going to be looking at is the detail on the medical records to support that item number. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
So a doctor or a practice can charge a private fee as such and not just bulk bill. So what are their obligations for informed financial consent?
So the same applies for a telehealth consultation as any procedure that you're performing. The patient needs to be informed. Informed financial consent needs to be provided to that patient. So quite often the script from your front desk staff will be, you know, we're scheduling the appointment. They need to actually also discuss how that will be billed, what's the fee, whether it'll be bulk billed. I know that a lot of GPs have used a script, almost like a checklist at the beginning of their telehealth consultation. They'll ask, you know, I know who you are, but what, you know, I know, but give me your date of birth. Are you aware this is going to be billed to Medicare? And they ask this sort of list of questions, which they will document almost like a tick and flick in their documentation. Just be mindful again, no matter what the fee is, no matter what the procedure is, whether it be telehealth or other, it has to be informed financial consent. Ideally, informed financial consent should be both written and verbal. For the non-GPs in the room, you're very much involved with informed financial consent because of procedures. That should be a verbal discussion as well as written. Yeah. In general practice setting, you often don't give a handout like the non-GPs do on the fees, but there is an obligation that the patients are told over the phone, or there's a message on your on-hold message what your consultation fees are, and signage in the waiting room about what a lot of practices do about what their consultation fees will be. Okay, Georgie, yep.
I've heard of some practices asking for patients to pay for the telehealth consultation beforehand, and that manages missed appointment fees and makes it easy for reception staff billing. Is that okay?
No, it's not actually. Now, let's separate this two ways. Let's address the cancellation or missed appointment fee. Now, that's fine to do that, but it's about, you need to inform the patient what are the terms and conditions of a missed appointment fee, and that has to be given to the patient. They need to be very clear. If you miss an appointment or if you're booking for a procedure, we're going to take a deposit. And if you decide not to turn up after, 48 hours before for a procedure or for general practice or other appointments, if you have informed the patient that there will be a missed appointment fee or a cancellation fee if it's too close, there has to be clear what the terms and conditions of that are, and it has to be told to the patient way ahead of that missed appointment or cancellation fee. The issue, that Georgie is particularly asking about is we are aware that some practices are taking credit card details from the patient prior to the telehealth consultation, and they're actually charging for that consultation before the consultation occurs. That is not allowed. You cannot charge for a consultation before the consultation occurs. You can only charge after. Now, some of our GPs will say, but I know it's going to be an item 23 or whatever. It's still against the Medicare rules. You cannot charge before. It has to be after. And then there's the issue of retaining someone's credit card details. Who does ask for credit card details before the consultation? Well, that's impressive because we know it's been happening, and I understand through convenience why it occurs. But if you're going to be doing it, there's a privacy issue. There's, the financial regulations around this. How do you destroy that card? How do you authorise that card to be used? Do you then phone the patient after the consultation, even though you've got the credit card details, to say, okay, we are going to be billing it. This is the amount. Do you approve? All those processes have to occur around charging somebody with a credit card. And as I said, cannot be charged before that consultation has completed. We've done about the face-to-face, haven't we? Yeah.
How do telehealth consultations relating to COVID-19 consultations differ from a standard telehealth consultation?
So, as you'd probably be very aware, the telehealth consultations relating to COVID, there's no geographical restrictions on them, on the use of telemedicine. Be very careful for some of you that are doing, particularly and you'd be familiar with it, for the non-GPs in the room, you have to comply with the telehealth guidelines as far as referral, the same as if the patient was coming in. What you need to be very mindful of is Avant. Check your indemnity insurance if you are thinking of conducting telehealth overseas. Now, we know some of our doctors, I got a query not that long ago from a doctor whose patient had gone up to PNG for 6 months and couldn't get back because of some COVID issues. And he was conducting telehealth up there and charging Medicare. You cannot charge Medicare for any consultation that's outside of Australia, but you also need to check with your Avant to see whether your doctor's indemnity cover will cover them for overseas. And the answer is mostly not, but there are some exceptions through COVID. But just be really mindful of that.
As risk advisors, we often see real issues relating to poor documentation of consultation.
So, we started talking about that a bit before, that when Medicare conduct an audit, they are looking at the detail in those consultation notes to validate the MBS descriptor that has been charged, whether it be telehealth, whether it be skin removal, skin excisions, whatever it is. I know that a lot of practices think that if a patient's computer screen is open, Georgie walks into my room, I'm the doctor, and I've got Georgie's screen open, and I have that open until the end of the consultation, that time that screen is open will validate how long you can charge. Like, say, if they were in there for more than 20 minutes in item 36, that actually is not the sole thing that Medicare will look at. So just being able to validate how long that computer screen was open will not validate the use of the MBS descriptor item number. You need to be very, very mindful what the detail in that record is to support that descriptor, and they will look at that in detail. I mean, who isn't computerized in the room? It's unusual now. Mostly it's only solo GPs who are towards the end of their career that are paper-based. So, as you know, with the computerized entry, it will automatically have a date and the patient's name, so you don't need to input that. But what if, and this is what we sometimes see, if the patient has been seen by the nurse, gone into the nurse, and the nurse is writing the notes, what do you do in your practices with regard to that? Does the nurse just continue on under the doctor's screen? There is an identifier. Yeah, good, good. Even if you're using the same records, like sometimes the doctor will go into the nurse's room, treatment room, and she would have, or he would have already started documenting what they're doing in there under his or her name. The doctor, if he's making a note, if he comes in and assesses the patient, he still should be actually notating in that consultation notes that was written by him. Any of you using medical or clinical assistants? Okay. Do you know what they are? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to go off on a tangent a little bit, which I tend to do. But just very quickly, there is a Certificate 3 in medical assisting. And I'd encourage some of you to have a look at that if you want to utilise your staff better. So there are certain things that they can actually do clinically related in the practice. But what we've seen in some practices, and particularly I can think of a dermatology practice, because some of them use them commonly, they'll use med students or whatever. They'll take the history, etc., of the patient, and they'll be the scribe for that consultation when the doctor comes in the room. It still needs to be very clear who's notating who's making those notes. So that's some of the issues around Medicare medical records. And, you know, some of the other big issues is to make sure that there's detail enough, not only to support the descriptor, but to actually support the patient continuity of care. A lot of our claims we see, particularly in the general practice setting, is because you'll have more than one doctor in the practice, and a patient may have seen Georgie today and the next week come and see me, and I'm another doctor and I haven't looked at the previous consultation notes. That's where so many of our missed diagnosis or delayed in treatment occur, because the GPs are not looking at previous consultation notes that are key. So do any of you perform audits on, or anybody in your practice delegated the role, whether it's a clinical director, medical director, on auditing the records in the practice? I'd highly recommend it's something you start doing. You speak to one of your doctors, the owners, clinical director, saying, you know, is it possible that we can randomly perform audits? That can be then a discussion in the clinical meetings about the lack of detail, and that is going to support you through a Medicare audit. If these regular audits in the practice, random audits are occurring, you'll pick up the doctor who's not a good documenter, and it could be key for you in so many different areas. Okay.
If you're not already aware, the Department of Health offers an email service for doctors when they're seeking advice on interpreting in NBS items, rules associated with that. If you're uncertain about the rules and item numbers, what they mean, you can email this asknbs@health.gov.au. And they've started compiling a lot of these questions and creating advisories, publishing those. And the one related to GPs is available on their website.
So it's actually a really good service. I use it from a risk advisory viewpoint when I'm working with some doctors and I have a view of one thing and they say, no, that's not correct. I'll write off, and 10 days later, roughly, they'll actually give it to you in writing. Keep it, always keep these, because if there's an audit, you can actually refer back to it. What about prescribing and telehealth? Electronic prescribing. First of all, you're in Queensland. Be very, very careful that every one of your doctors need to be aware that they should be using Q-script. And many of our doctors are being picked up now because they're not using Q-script. They're being picked up by the drug monitoring regulatory body. They will then investigate them and often refer them to AHPRA. They're getting huge penalties. You know, there's a financial penalty if you're not using Q-script. It's quite hefty. They have also used it in a way where they are picking up our doctors who are prescribing for family. So Q-script has now actually been able to take it one step further, where some of our doctors are being penalised. For prescribing for family, Schedule 4s and Schedule 8s. And many of our doctors are getting into trouble because Q-script are picking them up now. There's a really good education module on QScript. So if you haven't seen it, I think as practice managers and nurses, I think it'd be worthwhile for you to do that and go through the module yourself. Just search QScript Queensland. And this is also for non-GPs too. If you are prescribing Schedule 8s, Schedule 4s, probably not likely in respiratory, mostly best post-op for you guys. Yeah, but the key thing is the image-based prescribing. So are you aware that the rules changed as of the 31st of March? Are you aware of that with the image-based prescribing? So say telephone fax orders often referred to as owing prescriptions to the chemist, they've existed for a long time, well prior to COVID. However, now those orders are only limited to emergency medications. As you know, with the electronic prescribing, the patient is given a token, etc. Through COVID, you could take a photo of the script and send it to the chemist. That has gone now. You can't do that anymore. So it allowed them to take a digital image of a paper prescription, send it to the pharmacy of choice via SMS or fax. And there was not a requirement to be backed up with a hard copy. Of course, it excluded Schedule 8, Schedule 4s. So after March 22, image-based prescribing is no longer legal. There's an expectation that electronic prescriptions, as opposed to image-based prescriptions, will be used. However, any scripts that were written before the 31st of March, when the deadline stopped, they will still be honoured, until that expiry date of that script, if you like. You can still fax a copy of a paper prescription generated in the course of a telehealth consultation, so long as the hard script follows. So you've got to be very, very mindful of that. And we won't have time now, but it just came into my head. Are you aware of the obligation when you're prescribing of listing the active ingredients? Okay, if you're not aware, look up QScript and put in the keyword active, listing active ingredients on the prescription. That's going to be your GP's issue, but I hope that most of you are having regular meetings and these sorts of things are raised. Okay, say that again, so we better just get through this quickly, I think. Yeah, so just to recap, and it's not going to be any surprise to you, your obligations to the privacy and the choice of platform when you are conducting telehealth consultations. So I think the key message here is you need to still comply with the privacy legislation, no matter what platform you are managing with telehealth. I've already referred to, making sure there is privacy in the consultation, whether it's by phone or in person. So the numbers of kids in the car should be gone, shouldn't happen. You are obliged, of course, to offer a video consultation automatically, and you'll find, it'd be interesting to hear what your experience is, but I found a lot of elderly patients don't want the video, they just want the phone. But that should still be documented that it was offered and the patient wanted the phone. And you need to be very, very mindful with the platforms, your cybersecurity risks. And I think that is something that is always a big issue in your practice when you're dealing with online platforms, etc. When you're dealing with your staff. Georgie, do you want to just talk? Miroslav, what were the key points, Miroslav? Yeah, cybersecurity, as you're probably aware, you probably had so many talks about this, but one of the things I think is really important to make sure that you are very aware of, that your staff are educated about the use of phishing emails. Most practices, most businesses now will not allow staff to have personal emails on the platforms that you're using. We used to be able to at Avant, and we cannot access personal emails. Educate your staff about phishing emails too. I mean, I know so many of you probably see it even on your SMSs. I must get 4 a day where, I'll just block the caller. Sometimes you wonder what's the point, because they're randomly putting numbers in, but you just got to be really very aware of your cyber issues, how you can protect that. Again, RSEGP has some great resources on this. Nev, can you just quickly, because I know we're running out of time, talk about just very quickly about the practice policy cover for cyber?
It's
Now, practice policy. That's our technology for medical malpractice. Practice itself. We also include fire insurance as part of policy, and it covers things like traditional tax, ransomware, phishing, business interruption. Marianne, I know you're talk about that. I'll let you know. If we lock out more than 12 months, it will also cover expenses, also even up to period of time. So that's something you have consider very strongly about work practice policy. I might have a few words at the end, Marianne, about how that works. It's in the trifecta of insurance that should have a whole track. So that is should enter the yes.
Yep.
We respond, as you know, cyber is always top of mind and probably more and more from the practice.
And if you do experience a cyber attack and you have an event practice policy with us, make sure you ring the Medico-legal advisory hotline immediately, and they will kick in where we support you next. And the support is pretty good, actually. They'll walk you right through what happens next. They have professionals involved to help you walk through it. So just be very, very mindful of what is available. Make sure that you look at some of our resources on our internet. We've got a really good resource on Avant cybersecurity. And there's some really good takeaway message and links there to what you can use as a checklist if you like.
Just a checklist.
Oh, great. Okay. Because we're sort of running a bit out of time, just want to recap about the responsibility for follow-up after telehealth. Now, the responsibility is no different than if it was a patient in front of you. So, what's the follow-up with review of test? What's the follow-up with referrals? What's your responsibility with recalls? The same principles apply with the continuity of care. How do you communicate to the patient what will happen next? That is something that's really key for either the front desk staff to manage, to make sure that the continuity of care is managed and the patient does feel as supported as they would if it was a face-to-face. We wanted to just very quickly touch on, you're probably seeing a lot more, and it's probably not as detailed as it will, I think we'll see in the future, the use of remote health monitoring apps. And they could be glucometers, they could be oximeters, they could be a lot of blood pressure monitors, whatever. They are going to become more and more a part of supporting our telemedicine consults, I think. And we need to be very mindful of some of the advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are great. There's great collection of data that we can get. We can pick up when something's going wrong with a patient much quicker. We can pick up if the patient is non-compliant. It actually supports the telehealth consultation very well. And particularly if there is sort of a change in the patient's condition. And there's much more data available in the clinical setting. The disadvantages, of course, is that it's often reliant on Wi-Fi, good connection. They say there's a myth that the broadband is making it difficult. I don't think it's a myth. I'm hearing from a lot of you guys that it's absolutely a problem, particularly up North Queensland. But, I think the key thing is make sure that your patient is involved in this process. If they're using the hub monitoring apps, how are you calibrating it to make sure that they are okay and that the calibration is appropriate? Really ideally, you should be forming some sort of calibration checking process so that what the patient is reading is actually accurate. Educate the patient. That can be the nursing staff or the support staff that help to do that. Be very mindful. It's going to become a much more thing of the future. I want to finish just on business continuity. I had a really good example recently with the floods, and I thought it was really good to talk about this. First of all, I hope all of you have a business continuity plan, and it should be quite detailed so that if you have fire, flood, any disaster, total crashing of IT, whatever it is, you should have a business continuity plan that should be off-site. You can have it computerized, but it should be physically off-site, because obviously if there's a fire or whatever and it's all in the practice, it's not going to be any good to you. But it should include things such as can people remote in, elsewhere? If there is a fire, for example, or a flood and you cannot physically work in your rooms, have you arranged with another practice? or another facility where they may actually be prepared for you to use their rooms for a while. Think about this in advance, have those discussions, have it all there, have all the details of your insurance policies, who to contact, how it kicks in, who your service providers are for your equipment, everything else. It all should be in a business continuity plan. And again, RICGP has some really good resources on that. I'd really highly recommend, if you haven't got it, that you make sure it's in place. We had as you know, there's floods in Brisbane, and I'll just use this as an example. I had a doctor who was really affected in the floods, and his practice, the water came up to his reception desk, and he rang and he was panicking like crazy, poor fellow, and he was just a youngish guy, and his IT server was on the floor. So he thought he'd lost, you know, his IT hard drives and his server. So he thought, oh, this will be fine. I'll drive to my practice manager. She has the backup. You know where I'm heading with this, no doubt. She'll have the backup. So he drove all the way from Brisbane to the Gold Coast because that's where she lived, picked it up. It wasn't viable. Backup wasn't viable, wasn't able to be restored. So he thought, oh, I'm going to have to physically go into practice and get the other 5. None of them were viable. Now, the key message, and you've probably heard me say this before, you should be asking your IT providers to give you a written report regularly that they have tested that the backups are able to be restored and they're viable. So many of the IT providers, including this guy's provider, said, yep, doing backups, yes, testing it. Clearly he wasn't. And so this poor man was left with, how the hell am I going to restore? I've already had a loss of my practice with the floods. How am I going to get the patient records? And he was so distressed. So luckily, we were able to kick in and give him a fair bit of good advice. We have a great IT consultant guy who doesn't work for Avant, but many of you know Miroslav. He's been at Digital Medical Services at the conferences. He is an absolute gem, this guy. And so I rang him and said, what does he do? And he walked me through and he said, just tell him to get the hard drive, take it out. He'll think it's destroyed, but it won't be. Dry it with something cool, don't use something hot. And he walked him through what to do with this hard drive. And this guy was pretty sure that it wouldn't be able to be recovered. And it was. By walking him through how to actually retrieve this, get it out, clean it, dry it, he was actually able to get all of his data up and running. But the key message here is about the backups. And, you know, make all of that as part of your continuity plan, your business continuity. How many people in the room do have a detailed business continuity plan? Impressive, very impressive. Good on you, because it's really important. And particularly if you've, I mean, I know you weren't very affected this time with the floods, but we've seen some awful results in Queensland and New South Wales with floods. That's pretty much it. And I know you need to go. Do you have any questions? And as I said, we'll hang around. I've left where you can get more information about some of the items that we did talk about this morning. And you've got the slides, haven't you?
Yes.
So if any of you want a copy of these slides, Adrian will be able to give them to you. And Nev, and you're going to do the...
Yes. Shall I do that now?
Yeah, and I question. Oh, sorry, a question.
How does that affect how we triage the practice and the decision we make about whether we fit that person and whether we should fit that?
Not your obligation if they're not your patient. Is that what you mean? They're not your patient.
So they've not done an after hours, after hours.
But they're not your patient.
No, they are.
Oh, they are your patient. Okay, so I would think that the same triage issues apply there as if the patient phoned you themselves. So
can we triage pressure with that with reception? Do we have to? So I'm just thinking if they run 1-3 health,
yep.
example, told that to see within days or something. You know, and we make a decision not to see them, and then it goes back.
I think obviously each case is looked at individually, but I think if they've made the clinical assessment on the phone that they needed to be seen and they've told that patient they need to be, you probably will be criticised that you didn't, because they would have made notes to actually support that they felt there was a need to triage that patient.
So we're seeing more of they've got to be seen every week. And how do we combat this problem?
And they're an existing patient.
And be aware of it. You plan things, prescribing control, pharmacy. And we suspect if it goes ahead, there'll be a lot of that where the pharmacist, well, you've got to go see someone now, we've run out of ideas. And then we'll have to pick up pieces of that, and if we don't, we'll be criticised for it too.
I mean, you've always got the alternative that if you can't fit them in, you refer them to the hospital. You know, that if you physically can't, different if the hospital is referred to you, of course. Yeah, I know. But you still have to be, the same triaging rules apply no matter how it's coming in. I can understand that you'll be doing your own triaging and that's quite okay, as long as it's not being done by the front desk staff and it's been done by a nurse or one of the doctors. But if something does go wrong and that's documented by the 13 Health that they asked you to triage, you're still going to be in the frame for that, potentially.
So we do have to see them within the time frame they stipulate, basically. And where does that end?
Yeah, I know it's practically really, really difficult for you guys, but there's always that chance if something goes wrong, you will be criticised given that you were given the advice to triage them. It's hard though. Yeah.
Should we want it? I was just trying to think about this. But maybe we could start sending referrals to the specialist saying must be seen within a week.
Should we wind it up?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mariana. Thanks, Georgie. That's been fantastic. And once again, thanks to the PHN team for facilitating this morning. A couple of quick things I'd just like to close. We have the lucky draw for the Doctors Health Fund sports bag. Adrian, if you'd like to just draw out of this, it's in part. Okay, be quick because I want to miss out. There we go. I'll mix it all up, Adrian, all in the mate. Just grab one out of there. Actually, grab two, there'll be a second prize.
Okay. We've got Wendy, Milkgate.
Oh, wait, go ahead.
Wendy, yep, cool. And Cherie Wadsworth.
There you go. Mix them up, mate. Just in closing, once again, thank you to the PHN team, Adrian, Julie, Claire, Laura, and also Kayla, who's on the line. Just in closing though, to give you a bit of an idea where Avant fits in. Obviously, we're a medical indemnity insurer. Our primary and our core product offering is doctors' medical indemnity. However, as you can see from Mariana, Georgie's presentation this morning, there's a lot of other risk that flows on to the other entities that are involved in the patient care. There's basically three pillars of risk that we address. First one is the doctor. They have their own medical indemnity cover. The second one is your business insurance, which is your contents, if the roof blows off, public liability, that sort of stuff, which you would have glass, etc. A bit like your contents on your home policy. The third one, which is not well understood, is what Mariana was referring to as a practice policy. You may have heard of it as a medical malpractice. That's the third part of the trifecta of insurances that you should have as a practice or a practice owner particularly. And what it does, whenever there's a complaint made by a patient, usually it will name Dr. So-and-so of such and such practice. The practice may have no involvement in the issue or the matter. It still needs to unwind itself. And usually that lands in the lap of the practice manager because the doctor will go, that's your problem, you sort it out, I'm very busy. So it's something that I'd recommend very highly if you don't have a medical malpractice policy or a practice policy. My card's in there. The cost of it is less than a cup of coffee per staff member per day. That gives you peace of mind. But what it does particularly is that it insures and indemnifies the practice owners, and they don't really understand the importance of their obligations. If something was to go wrong and it was attributed to an employee that was the cause of that. But it covers not just medical malpractice, breaches of privacy, cyber is included, employment matters, Medicare issues, and we're one of the only, well, we're the only medical defence organisation that has got its own employment special counsel on staff, Sonia Black, who does a fantastic job, because we get quite a lot of inquiries from practice policy owners. Got a staff member, there's an issue, how do I manage that? or worse still, of an allegation of a staff member who moved on or I moved them on, of bullying, sexual harassment, blah, blah, blah. You hear all about it, you know, hell hath no fury like an employee who's scorned. So, and also the Medicare issues. We also have a Medicare special counsel lawyer on staff in Brisbane, and all he does is Medicare issues. So we've got a depth of resources to support you when you have that policy. So I give some thought. My card is in the pack. Give me a call or drop me an email. Say, hey, Ned, look, how much is it? How do we do it? I help you through that process, and we underwrite and price for every specific medical practice because you're all a little bit different. But and I help facilitate that. So that's really enough from me. That was the ad, by the way.
And my email address, if you do need some assistance, is Mariana, MARIANNA, full stop Kelly @avant.org.au. Don't hesitate, reach out. Don't hesitate to use a medical legal advisory hotline. It's a really great resource as well.
We'll close it off. Thank you.